Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week on The Final Straw, I'm happy to share a conversation with Rozalinda, Pura and Lynn from Villita Red de Solidaridad, or the Little Village Solidarity Network in so-called Chicago. The LVSN, in the English language acronym, is an autonomous community organizing project based in La Villita, or Little Village neighborhood, that networks with other residents of the area and neighboring areas. If you're listening to the podcast or online version of this episode, just an FYI that there's cursing. Of course, we're talking about baby jails. So, which is worse? Some words that the FCC doesn't like, or that? In the first hour, LVSN members talk about their organizing on the ground against Heartland Alliance, a nonprofit running baby jails, called shelters, around Chicago, in coalition with the Chicago Catholic Archdiocese. They also speak about the case of Jose, a young father who is in these facilities and faces deportation currently from Texas, where his family is. Information about Jose's case and how to support them can be found alongside more information about the work of LVSN, again on their Fedbook page, their Twitter account, or on their website, which is linked in our show notes, lvsolidaridad.com. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
From Embers is a show produced about anarchist ideas in practice across so-called Canada. Every week we spend about an hour going in-depth about ideas, histories, and ongoing struggles that we think are important. We're a part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. You can check it all out at fromembers.libsyn.com.
Keep an eye out in our podcast stream, website, and social media for a link to the latest episode of Bad News, Angry Voices from Around the World, which should be dropping in just a couple of days. Bad News is a 2.5-year running, collaborative, monthly anarchist news show in English with participation by anarchist radio and podcast projects from around Europe and all over the so-called America, North, South, and Central. You can find our back episodes of those up at a-radio-network.org. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a boy!
I'm looking through some statistics from 2015 about how Americans died. I think the statistics are quite revealing. I want to share some of them and see if you agree with my conclusions. In 2015, more than 2.6 million Americans died. That's the total number of deaths. But what is really revealing is how Americans died. Do you know how many Americans in 2015 lost their lives due to terrorism? Out of the 2.6 million deaths in 2015, only 44 people died as a result of terrorism. Yeah, 44. I tried to do the math on that to figure out what percentage of dead Americans in 2015 lost their lives to terrorism, and it came out to, I think, 1/10,000th of 1%. That's really small, infinitesimal. Of every 10,000 dead Americans, only one was killed by a terrorist. That means, by the numbers, terrorists in America are less dangerous to you than your hairdryer. Fewer Americans in 2015 died as a result of war than terrorism. Only 28 people died in war in 2015. Again, 1/10,000th of 1% of the dead people of 2015. If we combine deaths from terrorism and deaths from war and create our own category of people killed by terrorists and foreign combatants, we're talking about 72 people out of a total of 2.6 million deaths. That means terrorists and foreign combatants the world over, combined, are less dangerous to you than your garbage disposal. Now, let's go to homicides. Of the 2.6 million deaths in 2015, how many Americans do you think were the victims of homicide? Consider, if you can, all the news coverage you witnessed of all the murders, including school shootings and mass shootings in bars and so on. You know how many homicide victims there were? 15,696. And that's nationwide. It comes out to about 1/6 of 1% of all the people who died in 2015. To present this another way, if we add up all the Americans who died due to terrorism, and all the Americans who died due to war, and all the Americans who died due to homicide, we have 15,768 dead Americans. So that means, get this, that 2,610,650 Americans died of something else. You've got less than 16,000 dying from terror, war, and homicide combined. You've still got 2.6 million others dying from other causes. Now hear me out. I think we can draw some pretty reasonable conclusions about the allocation of resources to prevent deaths. After all, the job of government, if you listen to the delusional hierarchs who impose government on us, is to keep us safe. Part of keeping us safe is putting the money where it needs to go in order to save our lives. So consider, add this up in your head. How many millions or even billions do you think the U.S. spends combating terrorism? Now, add that to the billions that the U.S. spends on the military-industrial complex each year. Billions upon billions. Now, add that to what the government spends on cops and courts and prisons in a year. I would suggest to you that the funds spent in these three areas probably comprise more than a majority of the government's budget. If you made a pie graph, the amount of pie dedicated to terrorism, war, and crime probably leaves very little pie left for anything else. And yet, more than 99% of Americans who died in 2015 died of something else. We spend all that money to address supposed dangers that aren't really dangerous at all. Our federal government is squandering the majority of our tax money to combat issues that only kill less than 16,000 Americans every year. Now, to contrast that, consider there were over 31,000 suicides in 2015. That's about 1% of 2015's dead Americans. But it's more than twice the number of Americans killed by terrorism, war, and homicide combined. So imagine, what if the government stopped spending a dime on terrorism or war or homicide and instead devoted those billions and billions of dollars to suicide prevention? Think of the lives that would be saved. Provably, if we scrapped terror defense and criminal justice spending and instead focused on suicide prevention, we'd have a net gain in lives saved. Now, let's get to some more common causes of death. In 2015, more than 136,000 people died from accidents. All accidents. This includes everything from pool drains to light sockets. Anytime anyone's last words were, "Oops," they died in this category. Accidents make up 5% of American deaths. So imagine if we scrapped spending on terrorism, war, and crime, and we instead spent billions and billions making consumer products safer and training Americans to be more coordinated and less klutzy. We could significantly lower the rate of American deaths. Motor vehicle accidents alone killed 35,398 people in 2015. That's more than double the homicide rate. Yet, how many billions did we spend to lock up murderers compared to what we spent to lock up the idiots at the Department of Motor Vehicles who handed out driver's license to complete morons? If we were serious about saving American lives, we'd spend billions prosecuting employees of the Department of Motor Vehicles and ignore homicides, and we'd end up saving more lives. Say we cut the accident and suicide rate by just 50%. We'd end up saving the lives of 83,527 Americans each year. We would reduce our death rate by 3%. If we just ignored crime, war, and terror, and focused on the stuff that's really killing us, we'd all be better off. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 201 5638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Would you all please introduce yourselves, names and pronouns, and talk a little bit about Little Village Solidarity?
My name is Lynn, they, them pronouns, and I've been collaborating and volunteering with Little Village Solidarity Network for about a year and a half now.
My name is Rozalinda, and I use she and they pronouns, and I've been involved with Little Village Solidarity Network since the beginning, which I think it's about 2-3 years. And with a lot of the different threads that are woven through that network for a while now, whether it's local anti-detention organizing, housing kind of justice organizing. Those have been my pathways into this work.
That's awesome. Can you speak a little more broadly about what the project is and what it does? It sounds like the scope is pretty wide, which is awesome, to deal with like tenant organizing issues as well as like immigrant solidarity work.
So I think everybody would have a different narrative about this. A lot of the conversations that were directly led to forming Little Village Solidarity Network, or Red de Solidaridad de Villita, happened during the occupation of a public space, of a public placita in a kind of anti-gentrification struggle. And in that occupied space, a lot of different organizing and collaborating was happening. It was very alive and it was very intense. So even people that had relationships of working together before got to see that in a new way, got to see that activated in a new way in the specifics of this place. And I don't just mean this particular neighborhood. I don't live in this neighborhood, although I have a lot of friendships there. But in the specifics of this kind of place-time moment, right, of direct action in a autonomous sort of from the ground way that seeks to intervene, like through territorial occupation, in these dynamics of gentrification, but understands the dynamic of gentrification because of when and how they're unfolding as part of like a larger apparatus, right, of repression that is state-sponsored, that is capitalist, that's sort of colonizing, and that has to do a lot with the control of sort of migrant and illegalized peoples. So the different kinds of people met new people, but also folks who had known and each other and co-conspired for many years got to like see each other in new ways and got to like understand the activation of our conversations in a really different kind of way. So out of that came this idea of not just forming something new, but actually seeing that the work was already happening and trying to find a way to tighten, weave those connections a bit more tightly and offer each other more support in a more consistent way.
I certainly came to LVSN because of their work on child migrant detention, but since then have been present for the meetings and the support and things like that for all the recent victories with wage theft and eviction and the Bloodfruit Library, which is kind of a sibling project. So I see the diversity of people's narratives and their roles and passions in the group. But it was specifically the fact that Little Village Solidarity Network was one of the premier voices talking about migrant detention in Chicago that drew me to the organization.
And I think some of the stuff that's more direct than that has to do with direct action around, let's say, wage theft, right? And saying we don't really need lawyers or specialists or experts or appeals to authority to recover stolen wages. We just need to roll deep and go and hit up the bosses. And we actually enjoy that, and we enjoy the direct antagonism, towards bosses in general, and these particular, type of bosses in particular. And that as long as we learn how to do that, right? As long as we learn how to say, okay, when neighbors signal stolen wage situations, that we develop a kind of approach, and that approach changes and it grows, but there's also a kind of style, right? There's also a kind of acquired, learned practice. And then we start to, taste the victory and say, no, actually, you don't need a crew of that many people to be able to intimidate bosses into, not through debate and not through them agreeing with you, but through sheer intimidation. They're just so uncomfortable and so frightened, and they're losing business, and they just want us to shut up and go away. So it's a really, that kind of direct solidarity work with neighbors or, abusive landlord situations that can have what seems like a pretty short life cycle, right? Although it's ongoing. This other work with learning about and organizing against the detention of migrant children has a very long life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
This is where every little step takes many, many months for the needle to move even a tiny bit. So it's kind of bizarre that we're doing, or it's like great that we're doing both of those kinds of time frames.
Mm-hmm. And the tactics really are related to each other. There's a commonality in the approach to both sides of the work of direct pressure, and both for the unique ways that we've been targeting the Heartland and the Catholic Archdiocese who operate the detention centers, and then again, like you were saying, kind of cutting out the need for appealing to any other middle people in order to target bosses and landlords as well.
Is Little Village a specific place?
La Villita is what people who live in the neighborhood tend to say,
Mm-hmm.
which in English would be Little Village.
Mm-hmm.
So the joke often is like you can tell if somebody's like from the neighborhood or not based on how they refer to it. But yeah, it's a historically immigrant, Spanish-speaking, and poor neighborhood. Sacrificial zone, like with the really high, highest population density in Chicago, highest toxicity levels in Chicago, and so forth, and one of the highest rates of policing in the city. And in many ways, folks are involved geographically in that area. One of the reasons being that some of the housing liberation kinds of activities have been focused on that area a lot. And then from liberated spaces, it's word of mouth, right? From liberated spaces, it's like flyering or putting up things on poles or in laundromats. That's how people find out that if they have, bully landlords, they can go to this one place, or a neighbor tells a neighbor, right? Like, oh, you have stolen wages. I know these guys who get all excited about saying, going with you and battling to get your wages back. So there's kind of a focus of certain kind of work in this neighborhood. Obviously, the work that is about detention, broadly speaking, is not specific to the neighborhood. There's actually no detention centers in this neighborhood, right? They're concentrated in other parts of the city.
It's kind of, that's kind of what I was wondering about, is because it seems like the activities that you all engage in and like the networking and building of solidarity extends beyond any specific geographic place. Mm-hmm. And so it seems, it's kind of cool that it's called La Villita, because you're constructing the little village as you're going along. Mm-hmm. And it seems like because of the focus of work that y'all do on, space is such a hard thing to deal with in this settler colonial capitalist situation, whether it's the space, being able to afford to live in a place, or who imposes what borders on what people. Mm-hmm. It seems like your project is a lot about reimagining. You mentioned Bloodfruit Library. Could you give a little reference to that, or say what it is?
Sure. And I'm not the person who's been the most directly involved with Bloodfruit, but I'm super happy to give it a shout out. That it's been a squatted library of anarchist and other radical materials, and they host open hours for their library, host workshops, film screenings, and then have also been a physical location for Little Village Solidarity to meet and organize. And again, just very much a sibling project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a liberated social center, right? And so it can be welcoming of all kinds of initiatives, including skill shares and teach-ins that bring a lot of different organizing communities together. But I think Little Village Solidarity Network has been maybe the most consistent organizing presence, right? It's sort of like that's the space. Now, one of the things that's been interesting about that and really powerful is that in a lot of the organizing around, let's say, migrant justice or border abolition in Chicago in the past, as soon as the work gets to be more public or more seen, there's this sort of waves of liberal interest that pour into the space, and it's really difficult to then deal with that, right? So I've been part of fights against new detention centers for a long time. And it's always very difficult to sort of know how to manage the vast array of people who come at this and who want to participate from what I see as really problematic, really liberal, really saviorist capitalist positions. And these folks are like, there's a lot of them, and they're very enthusiastic, and at the same time, there's waves, and then people disappear, right? So this kind of thing of actually building relationships is almost counterproductive, because these folks aren't going to be here in 6 months, and yet by sheer presence and sheer numbers, there's like undermining a certain process of organizing. But when you're organizing outside of a squatted space, that takes care of all those people real damn easy. I mean, we would have skill shares and it'd be like 200 people show up, and there'd be the introduction and be like, hey, welcome, this is a liberated space, this is a squatted space, and then like the first third would just get up and leave, right? And so then you'd realize, okay, that people who are remaining are actually people who have made the decision to enter a space that's being illegally occupied, and they're going to spend an evening there. And then the folks who keep coming back weeks and months later are the folks who are continuously able to make that decision, right? And there's a lot less, the material and political conditions of the space have made it less necessary for us to put organizing principles into words, right? At one point with this detention center work, as more groups are involved, as more groups get created, as meetings happen in other spaces, we found that we have to actually say, oh, our organizing principles are about direct action, right? And they're about not throwing anybody under the bus, and about community self-defense against police and NGO intervention, right? But we didn't used to have to say that when the process of organizing happens in a squatted, illegally occupied space, right? The space does it for you, right? So some of the work can happen really in the small ways in that space. But as our work against migrant child detention has gotten more and more people involved, we've had to have open public meetings to welcome different people to get involved in that, right? Who are just like, are not interested in any of the other issues. They just want to like free the kids or whatever their interest is. But so we might, our space isn't big enough to accommodate that. There's a lot of folks who live on the north side who can't make it to the south side, right? So we've moved our locations, and we've had organizing meetings and teach-ins in different kinds of spaces. And we've also had to then become more explicit about where we draw the line, right? To say we'll do a workshop and teach-in for anybody interested. We'll support other groups' efforts to get prepared and get involved and do their own work around this. But in terms of organizing together and collaborating, we have to be very clear who we can collaborate with and who we don't, right? And we've had to put that in line, but we've had to formalize that in words. But that's really only after we left the space, right? After you leave the occupied space, you have to start to get specific.
And part of leaving the space and leaving the relationship that our organizing had to our space has then led to other groups deciding to self-form as well. Like now there's a Rogers Park Solidarity Network, specifically because of the detention centers in Rogers Park and the work that Little Village Solidarity Network and people in that neighborhood started to do. And that is another way that I think space has had a really interesting relationship with that work, is then seeing the newly forming autonomous groups in these different neighborhoods that, and we're always like, yes, it's your neighborhood, and we want to support you autonomously. But negotiating those relationships is always a very often interesting and fertile process. And seeing who comes out from different neighborhoods and what their relationship to their space is like is really interesting.
Yeah. So Rogers Park Solidarity Network is a very, there are a lot of really experienced anarchist organizers. There are folks who are coming from different kinds of queer liberation work, and also folks who are pretty new to organizing. So they have their own dynamic and their own relationship. They're also organizing in a very liberal neighborhood, which is a challenge that we don't have to deal with, like, glad I'm not in y'all position, having to deal with this when I'm flyering, So it's a really obviously kind of friendly sister organization that I think the communication's really easy, and there's a lot of trust that has been built up pretty quickly, I think surprisingly quickly. There's also the Free Heartland's Kids campaign, which is part of the Chicago DSA. And so that's a totally different relationship because we don't work within a party structure, right? We're not sort of like open to collaborating with political parties. We don't want to be in any way sort of used, right?
Because you're autonomous.
Right. For all the reasons why autonomous groups kind of have a critique of party politics organizing. At the same time, the folks who formed the Free Heartland campaign had been coming to Little Village Solidarity Network, to that space, to Blood Crew, for months to learn, had been throwing down, right, in actions. And then at one point said, okay, well, we're with the DSA and we want to form a campaign in the DSA. And so we're like, well, that's great for y'all, right? Like, that's y'all thing. So now we're trying to figure out, do we at any point collaborate? We've tried an action where we've collaborated. How do we draw a line between, well, there's the Free Heartland Kids folks, they're like always working, always researching, always dialoguing in a way that makes sense, right?
And consistent.
Right? But then they need approval from the party structure, right? So we're trying to figure out, like, it's encouraging that they're doing their own work, and then every time that there's a kind of intersection, we have to kind of revisit how are we going to collaborate on this. But.
Tell me something. Feeling comfy, people freeze to death outside your door. Christian neighbor, tell me, where's your moral compass? Bombs been dropping, wars been going, 20 years forgotten. Perpetual war for perpetual pieces of arms and legs need throttle. They yell about it and run from it, we run to it. These generations, we were born in trouble. I used to think I knew, learned some things that set it all ablaze. Capacity to learn and grow your neuroplastic. Don't let them tell you that you are metal. Catch me if you can, you never will. I walk on water when it's frozen. Potholes in my lawn, we plant persimmons. Every city is sunken garden, every garden some carbon. Fuck that eco bullshit, what's a vegan? All I'm saying, if you ain't killing or growing what you eating, you're alienated from your own. Dare I say it? Say it. Alienation. This ain't the top of the world, close to the bottom of it. Shout out to the northeast and the Rocky Mountain Republic. Born in the storm, I know nothing else, but I've learned to love it. I've learned to love it. This ain't the top of the world, close to the bottom of it. Shout out to the borderlands and the abolishment of it. Born in the storm, I know nothing else, so I've learned to love it. I've learned to love it. I knew a painter and used to shoot his portraits. Pseudo poet, trauma, rappers, all y'all do is cry in public. Keyboard fingers itching for some online nowhere competition. White rappers wail about PC culture. You'll sound like white supremacists. The wave shall wave, but not at my door. Maybe my kin to pray or be prey. They say it's kill or be killed, but y'all read Darwin wrong. Nature's a complex web of organisms working shit out with each other on their own terms. Out here in the barren wastes, I think I'm Snowpiercer. The ruling class is heartless, and it got no answer. So I spit that let's live fast but not die young. Lest they leave us no choice. If so, then when it's on, yeah, it'll make me sad. but it won't be that bad. Just dump my ashes in the ocean one last time. We going swimming, Dad. But first, I'ma give this kid a life I needed and sort of got that's dark like no light at the end of the tunnel, only an infinite dark void. And you can bet your ass I'll cry about that. Wish I could reach into it and bring y'all back, but you don't hear me though. What are my special powers? All I know is fight the power. Never fuck with no white powder. You out but you smoke, that makes me a downer. I keep my head on straight, everything's spinning so far. What are we but chunks of ice racing the distant stars? But we stay frozen, break down, or crawl through walls till the last raindrop falls and it's sand and fire for all. Sank the top of the world, close to the bottom of it. Shout out to the northeast and the Rocky Mountain Republic. Born in the storm, I know nothing else, so I've learned to love it. This ain't the top of the world, close to the bottom of it. Shout out to the borderlands and the abolishment of it. Born in the storm, born in the storm. I know nothing else, nothing. So I've learned to love it. I learned to love it.
You're listening to The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You're hearing my conversation with Lynn and Rozalinda, members of La Villita Solidaridad Network, which does work to support workers and tenants in the little village barrio of Chicago, as well as lots of work against detention facilities for undocumented youth around Chicagoland. They also speak about recently released leaks of internal documentation from a 501c3 called Heartland Alliance based in Chicago that profits from youth detention with about 10 facilities. More on Heartland and the Chicago Catholic Archdiocese profit from baby jails throughout the episode. And those leaks can be found up at heartlandleaks.noblogs.org. Could you all talk a little bit about the Heartland Alliance work that La Villita's been working on, along with the Rogers Park folks?
We can start with Heartland Alliance and the Chicago Catholic Archdiocese are the two local institutions that have contracts with the federal government to run what we call the baby jails, which is the detention facilities for migrant children who are called unaccompanied alien minors by the U.S. government. And so we're dealing with a national system here, but it's Heartland Alliance and the Chicago Catholic Archdiocese who are kind of the local targets who have the facilities here in Chicago. And most of our efforts have been at targeting Heartland Alliance because Heartland Alliance operates most of the facilities. There were 11 here in Chicago, and over the course of the past year and a half, 4 have been shut down. And then Chicago Catholic Archdiocese has a possible proposed new facility that we also may have stymied through community pressure because we've been monitoring it and there's been no evidence that it has become operational.
How many children are kept in these facilities? I imagine it ranges from facility to facility.
It does.
Yeah, and we have a little, list with addresses and capacities for each one. And we know capacity, what we've been told is that centers are near capacity most of the time. So we don't know how many are held each day. It also varies in each facility. It varies like throughout the month or the year. I forget the numbers. I can look and add them up to see. I think Heartland alone is at around 380. And then there's the Archdiocese and their
And that's between nine facilities, or 11?
That's between Heartland's currently 7 facilities.
Okay.
They have a way of numbering them, right? Well, these 3 buildings are one facility and whatever. So at these 7 addresses, but I can look at the sheet.
Do you have a sense of how long people are kept in those facilities?
There's what Heartland says officially. Heartland officially claims that the average stay of a child in their detention center is 41 days. But there can be a very long. And we also know from people on the inside that the average stay of children has lengthened considerably over the years. So it's the time that the children are held in these facilities is increasing and increasing and increasing.
We also know that children get shuffled between facilities. So each operator is like, oh, the average is 50 days for our facility. That might be the third place they're in. So they reset the clock when they shuffle, right? When they dump a kid from, between, they move them from one place to another, the clock resets, and then the statistics get to say, after, we released this, this kid after 51 days, but that person might have been detained for 100 or 200 days, right? There are, when we talk about the national picture, there's some documents that you can get at the federal level of what the federal government says the statistics are. The local operators, who are all social service agencies, they receive grants from the federal government to operate these facilities, right? They don't have to put out anything publicly, and it's very hard to FOIA them. It's very hard to access any kind of reporting because they don't have to do any public reporting. That's part of the reason why the recent leaks that came out were so interesting, because there was some documents in there that were the reporting documents of Heartland Alliance, right? So we got to see, they were a couple of years old, but we got to see how they report to the grantor agency about what their statistics are. So I think there's how long people stay in Heartland Alliance custody is not the same thing as how long people stay in custody per total. Right?
They also don't have to break down any information by demographics, and we've received information that there can be large disparities between the length of stay based on the child's background. So, for example, Muslim kids often are incarcerated far longer in these facilities than kids who are coming from Central America or other places. So there can be disparity that is very important to distinguish based on people's backgrounds, but that doesn't ever get kind of teased out in the data.
So you mentioned this leak. For listeners that haven't heard about it, can you tell them what sort of stuff's in it and what you know about its source and where they can find it to read?
So recently, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, there was a website that popped up. I think it was Heartland Leaks, in which it's just one page. It's just a front page that says, it's an anonymous hacker saying, we have obtained these internal documents of this operator of child detention facilities, and there's a link and you click, and it's sort of then, I don't know if it says decodes or transcodes or whatever, right? There's a thing that happens and then you can download it. Anyway, it's a bit technical, but so it doesn't open up in a viewer. What happens is that the files get decoded, I think, and then you can download it, and then it's a whole folder and you open it up. And so we've been doing for years research on both the national procedures and laws and structure of unaccompanied alien child detention and Heartland. And we've been doing research also by talking to former staff and volunteers from the inside. So when we saw these documents, we're like, oh, we are in a great position to interpret the documents, right? We have a context that allows us to look at, this 100-page document here, which is very much like, it's an intake procedure document, right? Which is kind of like bureaucratese, right? So we felt like this is something we can maybe uniquely do, is read the bureaucratic rhetoric. And when it says number of participants in the program, we know that participants means detainee, and we know program means detention, right? Or when it says SIR statistics, we know that SIR means serious incident report. We know that, from people on the inside, we know that a serious incident report is a disciplining mechanism, and when and how would it be issued, right? So we thought, that's what we're working on now, and hopefully it'll be on our website within a few days, putting together a primer for what these leaked documents are and where to find which piece and what that piece is, where does that piece fit into the larger context.
Because the two main sources of our knowledge as a community group are the extensive research that people in the group have been doing for years, pouring through congressional documents and tracking funding and things like that, and then building an analysis around that. And then also, as a group that has had former volunteers, former employees, and then kids who are formerly incarcerated come and give testimony. So both community testimony and kind of collective research efforts. And that this is a unique opportunity to kind of have those sources of knowledge confirm each other and support each other in providing an analysis for people to then take their own stab at these documents.
Well, I do want to mention one thing about that too, and it's a debate that we've had with other organizers who were saying, oh, but I know someone who's a former staff, and maybe we can ask them. And we'd sort of try to draw this kind of caution, because the folks we know who are former staff entered into that situation as abolitionists. You know what I mean? And the folks we know who are former volunteers entered into that as abolitionists who were like wanting to learn, wanting to explore, wanting to push the envelope, wanting to see if do the other volunteers, like do the other staff want to organize, what can we learn, what can we do from the inside. There's a lot of, and then there are a couple of ex-staff who did not enter it as abolitionists, but they became like really major leaks while they were there. They leaked to media. One of them got fired and was facing federal charges. Like there were people who like actually politically took a stand. Most of Heartland's current employees have totally drank the Kool-Aid, right? Like talking to Heartland employees is often really debilitating, because all they'll do is regurgitate the company spiel, which is, I think, like, what else can you do if that's your career, right? If your career and your, retirement account and your vacation money is tied to this job that you have, and you've been in it, and you need to be in it for the rest of your life, like, of course, that's the only thing you're going to be able to do, right? But if you have crossed certain lines politically, and you've kind of put yourself in a position to take risks for your political beliefs, that's a very different story that's coming out. And that story is actually in line with what we've been hearing from families and former detainees.
You're listening to The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. Pura now joins the conversation with Lynn and Rozalinda, members of La Villita Solidaridad Network, which does work to support workers and tenants in the little village barrio of Chicago, as well as lots of work against the detention facilities of undocumented youth around Chicagoland. The conversation now touches on the multi-generational aspects of resisting the jail and the case of Jose. Cool. Would you, now that you've joined the conversation, would you care to introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns?
Hello, I'm Pura, and I go by she and they. Currently just gentrified out of La Villita, and started to organize with La Red de Solidaridad de La Villita, because it's a community lifestyle.
So we're hearing Pura's family, who are 4 of 6 children, who are very militant revolutionaries, ages 3 to 8 or 9, who have been involved in more actions and workshops against the detention of migrant children than anybody I know to this date. They've been to all the different facilities. They've spent countless hours of their lives in front of these facilities, chanting to the children inside, writing messages for them, screaming for them. Just today, they spent hours in the cold on the sidewalk, kind of hanging on to the metal fences and shouting for the young people inside. And so they've just, during the conversation, like, all cold from the outside and hungry and stuff, right? And so in Pura's in and out, right, of the conversation to attend to them. But I just wanted to signal that this is probably not just the core of the membership of Red de Solidaridad de Villita, but sort of our joke, which is no joke, it's serious, is that usually if it's Pura and all her children are there, it's like, like, now we know it's a real action, right? Because they tend to stay the whole time. They tend to be very unafraid of the police. They tend to be very deeply involved in what's happening. They've had their hands on almost every banner, and their voices are always the ones that you hear, right? There's like not one action that I remember when I didn't hear the loudest voices weren't, really the kids' voices. So it's great that what people are getting to hear their voices a little bit, even though they're being very quiet next door. But so you should be hearing their voices. It's not an interruption. It's like they should be here. They were there today leading the chants.
They've been there from the beginning.
And that shows like a real element of like the fact that it is a community organization, like as opposed to just an event where people who have kids, like, or kids aren't expected to participate or aren't given space to participate. So that's really cool.
They were there from the beginning, and I think most of the relationships are anchored really by them. I mean, you can kind of tell, like, people who know how to make relationships with them end up being, like, the right people. People who, like, don't know how to make relationships don't end up staying very long because they're just, like, not understanding a lot of things, but, like, in a human and political way. So at least that's what I think.
Yeah, and you kind of wonder, like, what are we fighting for if you do not want to participate in somebody that's actually there next to you? Mm-hmm. You know, if you like children from afar, that's a different type of, person. Like, well, what are you here for?
But I think one thing that's been interesting for me is to see this sort of question of childcare and radical organizing, which I'm in two minds of. I mean, on the one hand, as a mom myself, but I co-parent with another partner who's like not into the same politics. So I only some of the times have my kid with us, but so sometimes I appreciate when people do this thing that is called childcare, right? Where some designated individuals are going to be particularly attentive to the children. That's their contribution. Sometimes I really think that's wonderful because it really allows parents to do what they feel is best, right? But on the other hand, I've seen that implemented in a way that assumes that the children will be in another space, right? That childcare is not participating with everyone. That childcare is like babysitting, And so when I've been happy about our collaboration, it's been when everyone saw themselves as the childcare, and then maybe when maybe the young people kind of were like the adult care, so that it's not like the only people who are really there for the kids are the designated parental adults. That kind of like we're all in it together. And when that space is created, which doesn't always work, but when it does work, it makes me feel like we're actually doing something together. We're actually learning. So.
Yeah, that's a society quote that we're fighting for. Community type. We look out for each other, and this just goes to show when we show up at spaces and everyone is taken care of.
Yes. I'm just really happy that their voices are going to be on the recording, right? Because we just came from an action, and it was their voices that were in my ear, right? The whole time shouting, "Libertad!" and so yeah.
Can you talk about what the action was that y'all came from?
It was beautiful, especially the way it ended. So it was titled "Singing Down the Walls," and it's continue to build relationships with the kids inside these jails, and to letting them know that we're on the outside, and right now we're using the excuse of like the holidays, just like caroling, but also it's we've been doing this before the holidays and after the holidays. We'll continue until they're shut down, but just showing them that there are people outside that are not like the people that are inside. The people inside are doing it for pay. We're doing it for their freedom, and to bring the community faces that they can communicate with and learn from, and hopefully we usually always have like other people filter into the movements, even though they we're just walking by, or I just seen this on Facebook or whatever sort of media. And so at the end we had this guy from the neighborhood, and it's always, I didn't know this was here, even though they live in the neighborhood, even though they live right next door. And so it's just us showing solidarity and taking up space that, not everyone here are bastards like those inside.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a solidarity demo for at a prison. And at this particular form of prison, which doesn't look like a prison from the outside, and which is right smack in the middle of a residential block. I think part of it for us is usually about waking up the neighborhood, right? About being in this public space and exposing what's going on. And a big part of it also is to just be loud so that the young people inside can hear us. And recently, just within the matter of the last few days, we've been contacted by a young person who used to be detained by Heartland here in Chicago at one of these facilities up in Rogers Park. and he reached out to us because he heard us while he was inside, and we met him over video phone call, and he wanted to speak publicly and very politically, and he wanted to be recorded. So we have a few short videos of his testimony where he is very strongly pushing us to keep doing this and saying, you all have a voice, you have to go back there all the time. You can go, I cannot. And you have to make sure that you raise your voices because kids inside can hear you, and it's very important. And they know exactly what you're doing. Like, we're always worried about, can we learn something in Punjabi, and can we learn something in Romanian, and can we what can we chant in all the different languages so that the young folks can know while we're here. And he's like, oh yeah, they know. As soon as they hear voices, it's like, oh, it's clear that it's people at the outside for them, and it's clear that it's not with the approval of the facility that's detaining them. Right? So today, after we chanted and the pigs came doing pig things, then on the phone was
Jose, an amazingly remarkable, resilient young. He's a survivor of the Heartland baby jails. He was actually in four different detention centers, and Heartland was one of them. We have 7 of them in Chicagoland, but we returned today to the IYC in Rogers Park, the baby jail that he was located. He was held custody, and he was able to share some of his music. He rapped for the kids, and we continuously played them. He was shouting out, saying that they have dreams and they do not belong there. And his voice was heard. We went around the building as close as we could and as loud as we could with the speakers, and we just screaming to the kids also, like freedom and liberty, and we're here. And he said he cried tears of joy. And though he right now also is fighting his stay, he has court December 10th, so please, if you get this in time to share this, he needs funds. He needs money for his lawyer. He has a battle, and he's in this alone. He's 18 years old. He's a father, and he lived in the United States for 10 consecutive years. Not that any of this should matter, just that he's a human.
Yeah. So when one of the things that happens, many things happen to young people as they are apprehended by immigration authorities, imprisoned presumably for their protection, right? And then their families and communities have to fight to regain custody of them, right? So that the state takes custody, and then the onus is on the family to prove that they are family, that they are able to be a good, quote, sponsor, right? And so while the children are sequestered, this is kind of we see it as a legalized kidnapping, when the children become sequestered, and then the family are told, hey, we have your kid, don't worry, they're fine, we can't tell you where they are, no, you may not call them, no, you may not visit with them, but if you cooperate with our investigation, and you prove that you are a worthy sponsor, then you can reclaim custody, right? That means that young people have to turn over information about families. And Jose refused, right? He refused to cooperate with this. Of course, he had family members. Of course, he was apprehended in the same place. He was apprehended in Texas. He lived in Texas. Whole family's in Texas. But instead of saying, yes, here's how you can find my parent, right? He refused to give any information. And so he was held for a total of 322 days, despite having family and a young baby, a newborn of his own. And all of this is happening, right? There's multiple levels of violence and sabotage of individuals and entire communities, of people's safety, of people's relationships, that happens through this kind of incarceration. When the young people or the children are sent back to their families and communities, they are still under deportation proceedings. So the families receive them, of course, severely traumatized with a lot of newly formed problems that they have no support in working through. Under deportation proceedings, that's a long, slow, form of violence that impacts themselves and everyone else. And now the entire family and household network has been investigated and has been, placed in a database that's shared with ICE. Mm-hmm. So it's really devastating in many, many ways. So in Jose's case, after 332 days, he was released. It's very sort of complicated how he was detained and how he was released. But he is currently still under deportation proceedings. He has a court on December 10th. Mm-hmm. And they all, of course, deserve our support. In this particular case, we're also very, mobilized by his courage mm-hmm. to make his deportation case a political moment. To want to speak out publicly, even though he's facing this kind of imminent court date. If he cannot, he'll try to get an extension. If he cannot get an extension on December 10th, he goes right into detention and deportation again, right? So, and here he is, really just before this, wanting to be public with his face, with his name, wanting us to amplify it as and broadcast it as much as possible, and saying when I heard you all protesting, I decided that that's what I have to do when I get out. I have to speak out. I have to fight for the others. So we're especially hoping to make connections with community folks who can help support him if he can extend his court date. Because if he can, then the legal defense for him, we still have a few more months to help support that, but it will cost a lot of money. It'll cost maybe up to $10,000 or more. So we're hoping to amplify his voice and the struggle that he really wants to be part of politically, and materially support his chances at fighting legally. So that's kind of, and December 10th is hopefully just the first date. Hopefully mm-hmm. after that we'll still have a few months to keep both raising funds and also just apoyo comunitario, just community support in Southeast Texas, people helping with rides, people helping with contacts that have advice, people helping with contacts who have been through this before and who can offer reassurance. This is a young person who's fighting on their own, without a car and without really very many people close by to him. So at this point, but yeah, he was there today on video phone. Mm-hmm. And seeing the building from the outside, he said, wow, this is surreal. I see the jail from the outside, showing us which room was his room, and describing the building and so forth. And then his voice was amplified so that the folks inside could hear.
And it's voices like his that are so buried beneath the lies and the advertising that is told, the propaganda that is told about these, because they're branded as shelters mm-hmm. and they're branded as places for kids who are in need of shelter and homes, kind of erasing the fact that these are children who are disappeared from their communities and their families. And it's really heavily pushed that these are children who have no place to go. These are refugees who are just in shelters as they're waiting to be resettled with permanent homes in the United States, or these are kids who are being rescued from human traffickers and the evil people who are out to get them and things like that. And so much of that is such a veneer, and voices like Jose's are so buried beneath that narrative. Mm-hmm. And so that's why having someone like Jose who wants his voice amplified from the rooftops is just incredibly brave.
Mm-hmm. In an update to Jose's situation, he has gotten a stay of deportation until June, when he will face trial. You can donate to his case via the LVSN Venmo at La Villita Solidaridad. And you can see and hear Jose's own words in testimony on Vimeo talking about how the kids on the inside experience noise demonstrations on the outside and the sense of desperation of youth inside. There's a video that we link to in the show notes that you should definitely check out to see his face and see him interacting with the folks from La Villita. Now here's a quick rap that Jose recorded to blast at the facility from the outside that he had been held in for almost a year, so that his fellow detainees could hear, words from the outside of hope.
Yes, I'm saying you, I was she. All I see is people getting full of disease, deceived. I'm just saying, we're talking about people. Let's just try to make it the mess of the equal. Just say it. When a second part, we'll come back the third time. We'll call it just a sequel. I'm just saying, we want to be so free. We want to get a cage and we want to take the breathe. Yeah, or even feel the breeze. Tell me, do you have a heart? Do you even sneeze? Cause people like you, they keep us backing up. They'll even hear us scream and f***ing yell. They'll treat us like we're monsters behind cells. Does it even ring a bell? I'm talking to you, the staff of IYC. We have my Tim, he was another limelight. He was put in many fights. Then here comes Chelsea, she was slimming with her blonde hair bright. And those blue eyes, as they ignite, they was filling them to fire with something that was surprise. I'ma keep going, everything I say is inside flowing. People out there, they're just here blowing. They wanna set the kids free. They don't, and they're tired of hearing all those kids all scream. Just like them, we all have a dream. So why the f*** you keep us back breaking up teams? That's not what this world was supposed to be. Now you make it something else, it's not what it really seems. Like I said, we'll reach for the stars, you reach for Mars, but our dreams are still bigger to reach so far. We'll make it through the dark, we'll make it through the light, we'll make it for the things, no matter your despite. And I'll say it again, I'm an immigrant, Jose, I'm here to defend, I'm not here to pretend. All you people inside there that were feeling like you helped relieve, you were put in a system with fake beliefs. I'm just saying, it's something that you have to take in, feeling everything that you were dying. Feeling now you're cutting up wings, people really aren't flying. If people want a hero, then why the f*** are you crying? You wanna help? Let us out ourselves. You wanna help? Help those kids that are stuck back there that dwell.
There are a lot of testimonies that other young people have given publicly. Unfortunately, many of them have done that in the context of lawsuits. All right, there's the 8 or 9 year olds whose families had to sue Heartland Alliance for the extraordinarily, horrible things that happened to these young people in detention. And so those are the testimonies that people usually have, and we read these testimonies, and sometimes in our action, some people have said we should read these, say these words out loud, but we also sometimes refuse to do that because these are coercively extracted, right? These are like, the lawyers say, well, you have to talk about what happened to you, kid, so we have a case, right? And this is what's happened to the kids inside to begin with, where they're interviewed over and over again by different staff, whether it's clinicians, whether it's other kinds of caseworkers who are constantly interviewing and asking for information, including information about traumatic experiences, exposure to violence, exposure to sexual violence, being kidnapped and so forth, like trauma in home country, trauma experienced en route.
Isolation.
Right. They don't often, and that's something that the testimony of Ramona Benitez is very clear about, like they don't often acknowledge the trauma of their own detention. Mm-hmm. But what they do is they constantly sort of probe for trauma, right? And so like 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds are being asked by social workers who are strangers and who are in a context that's not a therapeutic relationship, right? So all the time these young people are exposed to this pressure to have their stories extracted from them in a way that does not acknowledge the violence that is causing and how dangerous that is. It's extremely dangerous to force traumatic information out of someone, to say, well, if you don't give us your information, you can't see your mom. Mm-hmm. This is something we've been told over and over again, that is literally told to them, and the process requires that they give this information. And it's not enough to just say, here's one phone number, right? It's not enough. They're constantly asked for details, background details, more details. Anything the family members ask for details. Anything the family member says, the child has to corroborate independently, right?
It's all an investigation. It's not a course of therapeutic care
Right.
like Heartland claims. Heartland claims to provide social services and mental health care to the children, that this is where they go to heal. And it's such a farce.
Yeah.
It's an extractive and investigative process of gaining this kind of information from the children and their families.
To find information about the families, which can be sent to ICE, also presumably to investigate if these children might be eligible for a TVPRA, right, for a traffic victims protection status and some sort, right? Well, in order to be eligible for TVPRA, you know what I mean, it's like, right, what rape survivors have to deal with, where the investigation is often like seen as either re-traumatizing or even more traumatizing. This is what these young folks are experiencing, right? To sort of fulfill this requirement of seeing if you can check the box of having your case go towards TVPRA or not, they're subjected to all kinds of interviewing and questioning, which then the entire family gets subjected to as well. And that's supposed to be like, look, we are giving them a service, right?
Yeah, but not only is that, as you say, like cruel and damaging to the kids that are in this coerced situation, but it's also scientifically, like, if you're going for true information, if you're given a choice as a child, like, back to your family only if you give us these answers, like, that's the you're not going to get straight answers necessarily out of a kid anyway, if they were in a difficult situation, because they definitely don't want to be in the situation that they're in right then, right?
I mean, it might be, so we've heard a lot of stories, some of them including many of these young people don't understand where they are or why they're there. Many of them don't speak the languages staff think they should be speaking, right? So there's like young people from Central American countries who are listed as being Hispanic, you know, who only speak Mayan languages and their Spanish isn't so great. Also, they don't have an attachment to the Spanish language. They are being assigned a caseworker who is the Spanish-speaking one, right? Yeah. All of these, oh, well, maybe we can get a translator over the phone, right? All of these conversations are happening in this incredibly difficult context. I think even like the principal's office where you're trying to extract information for the kid is already a difficult context. And imagine the layers of coercion and terror, literally, I think, social terror that's exerted at different ages. What was really powerful to me about Jose's testimony is that, you know, he's really smart, he's really sharp, he's lived in this country for a long time, so he gets it. He's like, I'm not an idiot. I understood what they were doing. I could hear them talking. I could look around me and figure out where I am, right? He's like, the other kids couldn't understand, you know? But even for him, what he was expressing as the level of fear and coercion and his need to protect his family at the expense of him being there for so long, that's an horrific thing to put a young person through. You know, it's like, so what you were saying is, well, either you tell us this or you go see your parent. It's also the other way around. We need you to turn over. We need to turn in your parent. It's not just themselves. So that I think the older youth get that they're the pathway to the parent, the sibling, the auntie, the uncle, the, you know, and it's extraordinarily horrific to think about it that way. You know, imagine a young person who understands that they're being used to extract information about their family, and now they have to make that decision, right? And Jose's decision was having his own infant son to think about, I'm not talking, you know, I'm going to stay here, 332 days of refusing to cooperate is a long time, you know.
Yeah, the longer these conversations and the investigations go on, the more information or the more medicated the child can become. You know, it's forced medication, and it's also every day that they stay there, it's more profit for companies like Heartland Alliance or the Archdiocese. So it's like a whole system. You know, it's dragging out this information, you know, biometrics and the data of all the family or everything that the child can share, but also profiting along the way. So it's just like a win-win for the government, for these corporations, and leaves the rest of us, our community, these families, you know, to just pick up and run and hide when they come out, because this information is forever going to be kept in a system. And the system, you know, is really there to follow all of us, not just people that are being captive. That's one thing that people need to understand. You know, this is data that will always be in a library that they can connect us to our families to, and so, you know, we're in the bigger struggle. We have to understand that all of this has it's railroading. You know, it's either we decide to give up everything that we know so we can get out earlier, but then which kind of speeds up the process of deportation, or the struggle within the system of like hiring lawyers. You know, all of this is, again, money that's taken from us to someone else's pockets. And, you know, what do we win?
And just to give a kind of a sense of scale and scope, one of the data that we've come across is that since, 2002, 2003, there's been 340,000 children incarcerated in the unaccompanied alien children detention machine. And think of how many connections come just from those 340,000 children. How many family ties and community ties have been so impacted by this dragnet, and how much those children have been used as pawns, as hostages in extracting information from all of the connections that could be gleaned from 340,000 children over the past decade and a half.
And then terrorizing and pacifying the families and communities of 340,000 children. Because, 10, 15 years ago, there was a big old, migrant movement out in the streets, right? Where people were just like fighting it out and openly, right? And fighting for their communities. That's a different story when you have these many families who are now protecting children who are under deportation proceedings. It's really hard for us to then think about what kind of pressures are people under and how inhibiting that is of their ability to step out publicly, right? It's one thing when you're taking the risk, like I know, organizers who are really militant who are doing that even during their own deportation proceedings, like, fuck it, I've got an ankle monitor and I'm out there protesting, It's different when it's your kid. It really is different when it's your kid. And so it's not just using the kids to get information on their families and then to be able to swoop in, but it's also a way to make it really hard for migrant communities to self-organize. And it's then really pacifying of other folks who are like concerned about border politics, because it's telling them, well, don't worry, we're taking care of the children separated by Trump, we have a program that is an it's like they brand it as an alternative to detention. Oh, those horrible detention centers on the border that we all see on TV, which are truly horrible, right? But don't worry, because we have these shelters that are actually nicer. They've called them summer camps, right? Heartland says that it's like the best possible outcome for these kids. The pigs today were just like that, Do you mind saying what they said? Because it was horrible and cruel, and that's exactly what the system says.
So I'm not sure, did you catch his name? He was a white shirt, and he was so proud of himself. Everyone else was of his Piggly relatives were like, he's gone inside and he's gonna get to the bottom of this, and he came out and he was
so he went, so he went inside the detention center for kids, because we were all like yelling and screaming.
Yes.
Like, I'm gonna go and investigate if there really are children held hostages in there, right? So he went in.
And this is one of the higher up cops episodes.
The higher up with the white shirt.
Yeah.
Like the boss went inside, right?
Yeah, there was about 6 or so of them. I don't remember. But they were like, we don't know what's going on, even though this is their beat, and even though they drive past here every day, and they were trying to like interrogate people, and I'm not really even sure why people continue to speak with them, but they were not people. So they were like, I'm gonna ring this doorbell, and when they did answer, because of course they have cameras, they're watching who's at the door, so they also understand authority figures, and so they were like, make sure you're the only one that comes in. So he was in there, I'm not sure, less than 10 minutes. He comes out and he was like, they're fine, they just had tacos. And then he had the nerve to come and point at some other kids that were like, they're having a better time than these kids. I was like, how disgusting are you to point at some kids that are on the outside, that are with their families, that are dancing and singing and saying, free the kids, and, you know, that's just shameful. So I started screaming shame, and I also started, let's talk about domestic violence in the homes of cops, you know, like this is the garbage that he thought he would come out. He argued some more. I just really had to turn him off. Letting everybody else catch more.
Because he saw what it looked like, this residential space. I mean, he clearly saw it was a lockdown because of what he had to do to get in, right? But, you know, inside it looked nice and the kids were eating tacos. So he literally pointed to the kids outside. The kids inside are being better treated or better taken care of or something like that than the ones out here, right?
Is it happier?
Happier.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Happier.
So there's a real it's 2 decades already long. It draws on the foster care system, the racist foster care system discourse as well, right? That these facilities are rescuing children, black and brown children in particular, and sort of putting them on a better path. And this is something that's being done. It's a sort of white savior kind of rhetoric. And he reproduced that just like that. It's amazing. In workshops that happens constantly, we get questions. Well, but don't you think the kids are there for their own safety, and protesting is going to put the children in danger? But what's going to happen where would they be if they wouldn't be in there, right? Mm-hmm. So this white saviorism logic runs so deep that it's very difficult sometimes to break that open.
Asking a question with a presumption of what the answer is going to be, sort of thing.
So first of all, assuming that this is the best possible option, because these children come from communities that are so fucked up. That's the presumption is the adults in these communities have harmed the children. They have not been good parents. They're bad people. They're rapists, gangbangers, whatever, right? Or traffickers. Or they quite simply abandon, right? Quite simply, immigrants just abandon their kids. Quite simply, black folks are all criminals. Quite simply, native folks are all savages, right? And therefore, you know, the state, the white nation steps in to then rescue these kids through all these institutional forms.
And always for profit.
Of course, it's always for profit, right? So through these institutional forms, these children will now be rescued from themselves and their communities, and then they will be returning into their communities in this altered, you know, sort of like improved state. There's such a deep belief that these children are in crisis because their communities have abandoned them, and there's this image of like hordes and hordes of children with nobody except the state to step in. That a lot of folks, even after, in our workshops, after we give the statistics, after we give the laws, after we give all the documents, right, and the congressional testimony that says at the end of each year that the federal government has to do a tally and say, okay, how many kids did we detain? Not detain, they don't say, how many kids did we care for this year, right? And how many were released to families? And it's always like around the 90 percentile of these minors were, the way they articulate it is around 90% of them were released to families. But if you read that backwards, 90% of them had families, right? But yet they were detained.
Or 90% you could prove that they had families.
You could prove, or families who were able to provide documentation, or families who weren't too terrified to provide documentation, or who had the support to provide the kind of documentation and then be accepted as an acceptable sponsor, i.e. a sponsor who didn't have a criminal background, a sponsor who had a certain kind of living situation, right, which was deemed acceptable. So this, like, the burden of proof is so high, and yet according to their own records, 90% of these children get released to family members. And this is a very statist definition of family, right? Family means, family level 1 is parents, biological parents, of course. Level 2 is like siblings. Level 3 is like aunties, cousins, and so forth, which is considered distant, right? And we know that culturally, in many situations, what the U.S. government would consider a distant uncle or an unrelated friend from the village, in other cultures is actually like an extremely trusted family member, right? Yeah. So it's like we present this, right? We present this narrative, we show this, the quotes from the federal government, the quotes from employees who have ex-employees who have analyzed this, right? And then questions. He opens up the Q&A, and there's always somebody who asks, but what would happen with these children if they weren't here?
There's
Wouldn't
such a
they be
blockade of
lost?
fear.
It's the what about the rapists question.
Wouldn't the traffickers have them? You know, wouldn't the traffickers? So we used to also bring up like the one single documented instance of the trafficking, right? It was like the traffickers. Okay, so at one point there was this farm, this egg farm in Ohio, where a couple of dozen young people were unfortunately being trafficked into labor conditions. You know, the one instance, right? So 340,000 children detained presumably because of this one incident, which happened midway through this time frame. When you have an entire agricultural system that is like constantly needing and using and finding acceptable child labor.
In an agricultural system built on indigenous land.
Built on indigenous land, right? And when actually providing status and labor protections for everyone is the best way to protect people from trafficking. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can protect people, and when this is a form of trafficking itself, right? But still, people will ask these questions of, wouldn't it be, aren't we harming them? But what would happen to them? But oh my God, if Heartland closes down, then what will happen to these children, right? So these are the things we have to practice responding to, because we get these questions all the time, and there's a lot of fear.
There's so much fear, and so much kind of block for people to even imagine what a system would look like that reunites kids immediately with their families, and to not even have the seed of that planted of these children could be at home with their families right away, and not even having the kind of frame of reference to see how obvious that is as the alternative, and so much perception of these kinds of permanent quote unquote shelters being almost like the least evil part of our immigration system, and so the thing to even worry about the least and to just kind of accept it as the thing to kind of just accept, because there are so many more visible, horrific parts of our immigration system, and not sinking all the layers deeper to see how ingrained the violence is in this particularly invisible, particularly insidious, particularly accepted part of immigration violence.
Yeah, this is the one. People who will fight against any other form of detention centers won't touch this topic, right? People are like, but oh my God, but if anything happens with this thing, then they're going to end up in even worse, right? The reporter who recently was like, but don't you think? Oh, Heartland. Well, we managed to get the CEO of Heartland, and we got a letter from her, says the reporter, and she said that if we shut down our facilities, some other worse operator will open them because they'll be like a really bad for-profit jailer. You know, I'm like, says the current jailer, right? Like, this is who we listened. And this reporter had a hard time formulating a response. I mean, and like you had said, like Lynn had said, you know, this impossibility of imagining a reality, a social reality where this sort of kidnapping and sequestration is not a part of the picture. That comes, what's astonishing is that never comes from black and brown bodies. Yeah. I think only one time was it that one lady, and we were all shocked, you know. But it's usually, you know, educated, white, quite liberal, quite progressive folks who, if they ever got separated from their kid at the mall or whatever, none of this would ever happen to their kid, you know what I mean? Like, but they can't imagine that for someone else's kid. And so sometimes I just imagine what happens. Knock wood, if you have a kid who is 12 or something and they ever get lost, what exactly best case scenario that would happen with your kid, just imagine that happening with all the kids. That's all. That's all you need to picture, is that should be, right? For what happened with my kid, right? Knock wood again. Somebody would call. This young person would be missing. My mom is so-and-so. Here's the phone number. Somebody would call. Even pigs would call and be like, hey, lady, here's a kid, come and get the kid, right? And then you'd go, and they wouldn't be like, well, first we're going to hold them for 6 months, and you send biometrics, and you know, like, But for criminalized populations, right, that's definitely what happens with criminalized poor black moms. Like, we know that. And it's shocking to me that the very people for whom reunifying with their child would be immediate, swift, and not require imprisonment cannot imagine the same fate extending to the person next to them. You know, and they get stuck thinking, no, but for these folks, we need this protection. For my kid, we don't give that protection. Like, but for those folks, really, we would. And what would happen? What would happen with the immigrants? They would just be like you. That's what would happen, right? Mm-hmm. They would just be living your life, right? That's the hard part. It's bizarre.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You're listening to the Final Straw Radio, Villita Red de Solidaridad. Members Rozalinda, Pura, and Lynn are continuing to talk about the scope and logic of undocumented youth detention in the so-called U.S.
Can I give the example of the CTU?
Oh, uh-huh.
So here in Chicago, CTU had at their place of location,
Chicago Transit Union?
Chicago Teachers Union.
Teachers Union, okay.
So the same teachers that teach the children that are in the system, the public school system, they were going to have this big conversation on Tornillo. And this is back when Tornillo was up. And they were there, trying to explain what Tornillo was and how they're getting their stuff together because they're going to go down to Tornillo and they're going to fight a detention center for a couple of days and come back. And so we show up.
Baby jail in Texas.
Yes, mm-hmm. This is the tent city. And so, we show up and we're like, hey, this is great that you have this energy to fight the system. And you know that this is, wrong as hell. But guess what? We have 11 of them in the Chicagoland area. You don't have to go to Texas. Silence. They were like, well, the same questions, minimal, continued conversation. We're like, we can show up and do free workshops for you. We can help you, organize. You can come organize with us. Mm-hmm. About 6 months later, we're still waiting for one response from them. Right.
There is someone, we don't know who, shout out whoever you are, you rule, CTU Black Caucus. There is one person who in the CTU Black tip, we see it. We see this person. But we really said, great, let's talk, let's have a conversation, right? Let's do a workshop, let's do something. There's with the folks in Gary where it's like the progressive mayor of Gary went to Texas to see the baby jails, right? Everybody goes to Texas to fight the baby jails. It's great. It's shut down Tornillo, shut down Homestead, all of them, right? One of the things that we're trying to, not only to say, hey, there's ones here too, but also to point out that the ones in Chicago and the 100 and, last count, 60 some others, right? There's 160 some of these currently. These are called the permanent shelters. These are seen as permanent long-term facilities. The Tornillos and Homesteads are so-called influx facilities. They're temporary. When they open them, there's like, oh, we have an influx, which of course the government creates the influx, right? And then they say, oh, we have a capacity crisis, so we're going to open some odious thing. Knowing full well that that's a temporary facility, right? Mm. So everybody's going out to fight the temporary facility and close it down. It's like the logic, right? Let's go fight this thing that's going to, it's horrible, it shouldn't exist, but it will be out of commission within a few months, guaranteed. Mm. It was opened with the design to be closed in a few months, and everybody goes and fights it the last 2 months that it's in existence, and then they celebrate a win. I don't want to be cynical and say that it didn't matter. It did matter. It hugely mattered to everyone that people fought like hell against Tornillo and Homestead. What we are concerned about is that then everybody went home and said, we've struck a blow, as opposed to saying, what happened to those kids who were held there? Because before those shutdowns, there were 110 so-called permanent facilities. Now there's 160 something. So while the big spectacular fights against the big spectacular temporary shelters, so-called whatever camps, are happening, very quietly, these permanent ones that look nice from the outside are growing and growing and expanding. This is the expansion of a permanent system that goes unaddressed, unbattled, while people celebrate the very few and very deserved victories over these big temporary ones. So it's not either or at all. We want it to be and, right? And so we've always told people that, we want to lift up the struggles against these big spaces, these big detention camps, as well as reminding folks, like, without the heartlands, there would be no tornillo. And this is where, that's the part that's a bit more difficult for folks to get, you know, because it's really, the operators of these things and the federal government have, the way they say it is, well, it's either heartland or tornillo, right?
And these big ones that fester, the big influx facilities that are purposely left to fester and gain public opinion, are used to then justify the slow and creeping expansion of the more permanent, more powerful system.
In a similar way that the Democrats made a big hoo-ha about fighting Trump's family separation policy, right? So there was some Democratic legislator of some kind with a big nonprofit making a big community protest in front of the Homestead facility already a year and a half ago, when it was the big sort of stop separating families moment. They were having a big protest and a press conference in front of this facility that was holding over 1,100 kids at that time. And their press conference was, I kid you not, you can Google it, "We are here to express our concern because 90 of the children held in here were separated from their families by Donald Trump." Right? And I immediately got on Facebook with this person who was live streaming it, and I said, "This is great, awesome. Can you also express concern about the other, 1,000, whatever, 10, right, who are also separated from family?" But the Democrats used, and a lot of the NGOs funded by, the NGO complex, the corporate NGO complex, really seized upon that moment to propel themselves in the spotlight by championing only a certain segment of kids, because for them it was a good anti-Trump moment. It was a good moment to get political capital. And they were completely happy to throw all the other ones under the bus. We saw it happening in the media, and then we were told by our folks on the inside that the so-called separate, right, now there's two kinds of kids. There's the separated kids, who are in there as a result of this one policy of Donald Trump's. And then there's the regular detainees who should just be in there, rot in there, right, because we don't care, right? Those are the unaccompanied kids. The media spectacle around the separated kids led to expedited procedures for reuniting them. So all the staff inside Heartland were putting the cases of the kids who are not the separated kids on the back burner, because legal attention, media attention leads to procedures being expedited, right? This is the kind of diabolical thing that it was created just so a certain segment of the political machine could claim a victory, right? We've reunited the separated kids, right? And this idea that there is such a thing as unaccompanied children, when it's these kids are made to be unaccompanied, these kids are disappeared kids, but they no longer count because they're not separated by Trump.
This might be a good moment, too, to tease out a little bit what does an unaccompanied alien child even mean under this system, because I'm not sure we've kind of spoken explicitly about that yet today. I'm just, who are the kids that were thrown under the bus by this rhetoric of separating, or the separated kids versus the quote-unquote regular unaccompanied kids. So the way that the government qualifies these kids as unaccompanied is if they are apprehended at a port of entry or at a border, and cannot prove that they are with their legal guardian. So they could be with a sibling, they could be with a family friend, they could be with a coyote, they could be with many different options of an adult they're supposed to be with. But if that adult cannot prove that they are that child's legal guardian, as determined by the U.S. government's kind of definition of a legal guardian, then they can be considered unaccompanied. You can even be, sometimes there's examples of young people who are married and one of the spouses is over 18 and the other one of the spouses is under 18. The spouse who's under 18 will still be qualified as unaccompanied.
They're together. They're traveling together.
They're traveling together.
Their child, for example. Right?
And then as soon as a child is determined by border enforcement to be unaccompanied, quote unquote, they have 72 hours to then turn that minor over to this other permanent shelter system. Of course, that can be significantly delayed, but law enforcement technically is supposed to then funnel this child into the more permanent investigative stage of this unaccompanied alien child system. But just to tease out, why are these kids considered unaccompanied? It's a very kind of specific legal definition that the government has of that really does result in kids being disappeared from the families and the communities that they are supposed to be with, and also doesn't acknowledge the fact that so many of these children are separated from their legal guardians in the first place because of U.S. immigration policies and because of the violence that is done in separating families and what families have to go through in order to kind of establish a presence, bring their children over, things like that.
Right. Families are often forced to make different kinds of travel arrangements for the adults versus the children because of the risks that they didn't create. It's not like a choice people make, and it's like, this will be like nicer, to travel in these different paths.
This is the Final Straw Radio. LVSN members Pura, Rozalinda, and Lynn talk about their work to disrupt public events to raise money for the Baby Jailers Heartland Alliance by well-meaning liberals and so-called philanthro-capitalists.
But the image that the administration presents is that, like, especially during the caravans, that it would be just an army of children without any adults around, right? And so this was like a saving of the children.
And that by implication, those adults are like irresponsible maniacs, right? Because who would leave children to travel like this, right? By implication, anyone who would claim to be an adult caretaker is someone who's not fit, It's not just the trafficking scare and so forth, which is like inflated and bullshit, but it's also the kind of demonization of poor immigrants of color in general, right? As though they are just like came up with this logistical idea that kids should travel in this way, when a lot of kids do have to travel in modes of crossing that are specifically for children, unfortunately.
Those romanticized in the hypocritical Bible where Moses is put in a basket, and now this is celebrated. This is when the Holocaust survivors, and I'm not speaking of indigenous Holocaust, but when children were sent abroad, sent to other countries to save their lives, people are not getting to the root of why people are running for their lives, why children are sometimes sent either ahead or sent after, there's been a safer space set. And this is what we need to do is get these stories out so that people understand, it's a play on words, for the system to benefit. And, we're always expecting other people to, either not know the whole history or to just find out on your own, or just to accept the garbage that they're taught in schools or, in some nursery rhymes or, whatever way that people are able to pick up their knowledge.
And it does seem from what we can glean that most of the young people and kids detained in this way have been apprehended during their crossing in some way. But there's also young people in there who were apprehended in other ways, right? Like Jose was apprehended by the police.
After being here for 10 years.
Right. Yes. So just like any police contact when you're a minor and you're brown and they suspect that you're don't have status, will end you up in this form of detention, right? And so we know how much cops are looking for young brown men, right? I'm sure it's not a rare occurrence. And this idea that the police don't collaborate with ICE, and we're like, Chicago's a sanctuary city. That's bullshit, right? That's bullshit. This is a well-greased pipeline. So part of it is what I was saying, which is this our historic memory of other moments and other processes whereby entire peoples have been forced to send for their children in a particular way or send their children to safety in a particular way. And not understanding this as being a continuum of that. Part of it is also not understanding that that's not the only way that families are apprehended. And that's not the only way that children are kind of kidnapped from and disappeared from their communities. And so this narrative of we're rescuing them by incarcerating them is really, it's and on the one hand it's like how dumb is that and how obvious, but on the other hand, because it's been in this particular institution of the Unaccompanied Alien Children program, it's been very successful since the Homeland Security Act, right? That's kind of what finalized. I mean, there's other pieces to it, but the Homeland Security Act is sort of the central legislation. the way it was codified in the Homeland Security Act and in its implementation since then, it has been so acceptable. And I do think that it's not just the conservatives that are responsible for this. I think the liberal and progressive institutional left has done a huge, has had a huge contribution in normalizing this and holding this up as a good thing. So it's like often in our work, it's like, it's not the fascists who end up being the ones we have to struggle with, right? It's like the liberal, it's the white liberals that we end up having to struggle with, who are holding up this system as a success and as a model, right? And something that they support. They donate to freaking Heartland. How many times do we see concerned group of progressive white ladies are having an event to raise funds for the immigrants? Who wanted to raise funds for? Heartland. If you were in Chicago and you love the immigrants and you want to save the children,
Give money to their jailers.
Give money to Heartland, and then we show up, we disrupt their events, and they all cry. It's great.
Or they're like, why don't you speak to your alderman? The alderman can't even fix the streets.
Yeah.
But like the aldermen do not know, that these baby jails are in their community. They know. Maybe they're even donating, or they've received, donations from Heartland.
Of course. These are not, when we go to the, so we go to little, if it's a little fundraiser and we find out about it, we might show up and like ruin their whole night. And then by the end of the evening, there's like no donations going to Heartland, one way or the other. But so it's like great. I think if we could finally get the word out so we don't have to, people would just like stop doing this because they just don't want us to mess up their party. That would be great. We try to show up at Heartland's annual fundraiser as well, where it's the big bucks, where it's like Exelon will throw down whatever, $50,000.
The Ford Foundation.
Yeah. The Ford Foundation, the Pritzker Foundation, like the entire philanthrocapitalist machine of, not just Chicago, right? But especially the ones that are anchored in Chicago. They all show up with their big money thing, and they all like have a great soiree, and there we are like outside screaming and trying to get it, like trying to mess up their moment. It's really it's really particular going up against what the liberal and institutional left and the philanthrocapitalist machine that funds it hold up as a success story, right? Because Heartland has multiple branches. So they have 5 branches. Their corporation is really huge. They have 5 different branches, only one of which is their baby jail branch, right? But 70% of their federal funds come for baby jailing, right? So their brand is, we're a social service agency that does
they do needle exchange and harm reduction stuff, right?
Well, yes, that's their so-called, they have their affordable health care branch.
But so does CRE.
They have their so-called affordable health care branch, which is like not free health care, not socialized health, universal health care, okay? It's where they get to, profit from being the nonprofit mediator of what should be universal, right? They get to do that. They get to do so-called affordable housing, which is not socialized housing. It's not universal housing. It's not a fucking victory, right? It's just them taking a market share of what should be free housing, right? Universal housing. So they have all these branches that do good, and they say, well, one of our branches is also a kind of form of harm reduction in terms of getting kids out of worse situations. But if you look at both the conditions of the work that they're doing and the funds, you could flip it and say, well, actually, they're a child jailing company. 70% of their federal funding comes from that, who also does these other things on the side, and because of their image, they can pull in huge donations from the private sector, right? And all those come from politically influential, corporate players and so forth. So it's really insidious. They're all in bed together.
Yeah, and it's really, I think we're situated in a unique moment too, because of how much attention the separated children got in the liberal media. The children who, were with people who they could prove were their legal guardian, but were still separated under Trump's new policy, which is just on the same spectrum as what was already happening. But just the amount of attention that received, this moment might not be occurring, and people may not be introduced to this struggle like, it would be much more difficult, in my opinion, to be doing some of the momentum that we're building during the Obama administration, where this was going on just as much. There were huge influxes of this. I mean, this struggle is not new to the Trump administration, but people are even gaining the slightest bit of literacy about this system because of all of this liberal outrage about the separated children. And again, sometimes that ends up kind of throwing people under the bus or turning them off from the substance of the work, but then in other ways, it's some of the only reason why certain people are even listening to us at all. And that's a really interesting moment to be working through the complications of, and to be taking on this liberal establishment with something like Heartland. So I just feel sometimes that we're in a really surreal moment in the struggle, and the people who are listening and the people who are tuning us out.
I think so. People often say to us things like, "But what would happen if Heartland shuts down? Wouldn't they just send the kids somewhere else?" It's the same argument that anyone doing abolitionist work. That anytime you try to shut down a prison or the building of a new prison or the expansion of a prison, that's always, well, won't they just send them somewhere else, farther from cities, farther from legal support, farther from any kind of community struggle? And it's like, oh, because it's just a whack-a-mole, isn't it better that they're in Chicago? Isn't it better that they're with Heartland? Shouldn't you just work with Heartland and volunteer for them or do toy drives, right? Isn't that a way to improve the situation from inside? And so, it's always an uphill battle to arrive at where that doesn't make any sense, right? And there's no soundbite response to that, unfortunately. So people have to be willing to listen to the long answer. But one of the ways that we've been able to condense it is to step back and say, well, this isn't just any operator. Heartland is in the top 5 operators of child detention facilities. And actually the top 3 get most of their funds from influx facilities. So if you only look at the permanent ones, Heartland's in the top 2 or 3 right now. Now they're expanding, there's new contracts. But we are in a city that has a concentration of this institutional form, right, carceral form, and has one of the top operators of that. So any abolitionist struggle would be like, are we nuts? Like, we have got to get on this. Because if we can hit this one operator, we are going to have a huge impact nationally. If you can hit one of the top 5 operators in any, you know what I mean? And they shift at all, they budge at all, they crumble at all, they have a harder time raising funds, they have a harder time keeping up their veneer and their discourse, their social license starts to crumble. Like, that has a huge impact. They're a major player, right? We're not working at the far galactic edges of this thing. We're in the middle of this thing, right? Like, it's like the people who are like doing frontline work on the border, like, in terms of this particular institutional structure, we're in the right smack middle of it. And that's what we try to get people to say, like, imagine tomorrow we put so much, but Heartland is so fucking embarrassed and broke that they can't do this anymore. They can't renew their stupid fucking contract in February of 2020. They will have to come out and be like, yes, well, we decided, just like Tornillo, the operator of Tornillo, right? What he said, yes, because this is unconscionable, and I told the Trump administration I will not do this anymore, right? Heartland will have to come out and will have to say, like, we are on the side of the immigrants, and this is not good, whatever. And, like, ripples onto the entire market, right? We know that there's groups all over the country that are watching, some of them are fighting, some of them are trying to fight, maybe they feel isolated. We think, and some of them are starting to do the work, we think it will have a huge impact on like really accelerating this kind of process, right? A sort of like expansion of the abolitionist process, if we can get Heartland to start to crack. And also, we're committed abolitionists, and this isn't the only form of imprisonment we fight, right? We want to work with other folks who are long time invested in struggles to close down all forms of incarceration and exploitation, and to make sure that this form is also on their map, right? That they see it as part of the universe that they're in. That seems big too, because we're also in a big abolitionist town, right?
Right. And yet, so many Chicago abolitionists have no idea about this system. And that's something that we're kind of also trying to put more energy into openness of how do we collaborate more with Chicago abolitionists who are doing these struggles in other ways, but this system has been invisible to them as well. And so how do we build solidarity and support between the struggles that Chicago has a really, fertile history of throwing down for? Because there really is a gap. There really is not a lot of communication or understanding between kind of a lot of the more common or well-known Chicago abolitionist struggles and this.
And if we talk about the scale, what we've been able to accomplish with the support of community, we've been able to shut down buildings and the children have gone home. So imagine if Heartland were to finally, have a conscience and speak out in NIJC and use their power to help these families actually. Again, we do this with an almost practically zero budget out of our pockets. If anybody wants to send money, send it to Jose. Send it to LVSN, we'll forward it to Jose. But again, the whole idea is that, we are doing the work. We're doing the work the best that we can. But this is a small group of us. And if more people were to jump on board, we have, again, we're in this town of Chicago where everybody's fighting for no copycatting. Everyone's fighting for all different sorts. If we all come together, people are always still even we've been fighting for this, year and a half, almost 2 years. People need to see the connections of the importance of these children, but everybody's still stuck under the idea of their shelters. We can triple easily our daily support when we're out there if people just stop to accept the spoon of Hartman and of the idea of, we're helping the kids. Again, you have to take it in all together. And if you're against, the prison system, if you're against the police, which of course we need to understand that it's just all one system. They're two arms of the same body. Why are you not showing up for the kids? The kids they should be our main source of support. We need to, find ways to branch together and to come out.
Yeah, and I think when we try to reach out to other groups, we never, we don't do it, but we always show up, and we have for years, right, for any kind of anti-prison, anti-pig stuff. But it's not like we'll go into those contests and be like, yeah, and you should show up for the, it's not about taking people away from the center of their organizing, and they're sort of the front of the struggle, right? It's just about saying, we want to make sure that you also see this. These are complementary, and that you will know what to do with that, right? You and your struggle will know how to make the connections. You will see the opportunities, right? You don't have to come to us, our thing that we organize, right? But let's see each other and let's hear each other. And as we move forward, we'll recognize ways that these things can sort of ripple out towards each other, right? And I think in the recent action up in Rogers Park, that was really obvious. People were coming from queer and trans liberation organizing. People were coming from black liberation organizing. People were coming from long experiences fighting the foster care system, fighting the juvenile detention system, and who spoke at this and saying, this is how I see the connection, this is why I'm here. So it's definitely starting to be more, and the conversations we had today, right, were with folks from the neighborhood who were particularly, impacted by policing and incarceration, who are seeing the connections right away. So I think I feel personally that we just need to catch up a lot, right? We just need to have some kind of presence in people's consciousness, and that those connections will be built as we organize. We also don't want to exceptionalize this group of kids, right? That's this is sort of the entry point. And I think it's an entry point for many, many reasons, including how difficult it is, and including that the only way you can move the needle on this is if you take on the entire logic that makes it possible. And so that's an intersectional logic in its nature. And so that will hopefully bring us more and more and more into contact with all other kinds of abolitionist organizing.
Just as an awareness of sharing the same landscape. and to kind of have a mutual flourishing and a mutual strengthening from that awareness, not detracting anything, but just, kind of the sense of the shared.
It's also different because we're, like, different groups work in different ways, right? And we've heard things like, well, if y'all want to collaborate with us, you should have a very formal, your leadership and our leadership, you know, and we just like, but we don't do that, you know, so we just kind of show up for each other. It's sometimes, there's a lot of abolitionist work that's really great work that is done differently through membership organizations, right, or with organizations that have kind of a central leadership function. And so the actual practicalities of how autonomous groups working create like relationships collectively, not as individuals because we all know each other, but like actually create and negotiate collaborative relationships with other groups that work in different ways. It's like, oh, well, yeah, we want to do this, but let's get with our leadership. You know, we're like, we never know, like, what's the protocol? Can we even ask this group if they're willing to like support, co-sign the letter? You know, like, well, yeah, we can ask them, but they have a whole protocol, right? So it's like, oh, we don't know that way of organizing, right? But recently we've had a great experience with that, of testing that and of learning, like, how do different groups work? What kind of protocols do they have? It's just because we're all like getting the same issues or seeing the kind of political intersections in a theoretical level doesn't mean that we know how to dialogue about how do we make decisions and how do we move? Like literally, how do people collectively move? People have different practices for that, and we may not. And I think we make a lot of assumptions back and forth, right? So in the recent protest against the Heartland fundraiser, there was the keynote speaker for Heartland's fundraiser was Angela Glover Blackwell, who is has a very recognizable brand as a media person and as an abolitionist, or as a person who speaks out against prisons, and yet she is a keynote speaker for the Heartland fundraiser. And so folks got together and drafted an open letter. And I'm so glad that the collective decision was to make an open letter to her, not we're going to just have a private negotiation, right? Because we don't want to antagonize this person or whatever. So it was an open letter asking that she refuse to speak and that she make a public statement as to why she's refusing to speak, right? And then we reached out to all different kinds of abolitionist groups and community groups in Chicago and said, would y'all support this letter? Because we're going to send it. This is the letter. This is the reason. These are the arguments we're making. And it can come just from our groups, or you're welcome to go sign. And that was kind of interesting because a lot of folks were very eager and quick to respond to that. So I think certain kinds of actions can have that fluidity of collaborating easier than other kinds of actions like protests or like even workshops and stuff, like fitting in. How do we give a workshop for this group, or they want us to give it for their leadership before, it's really complicated, right? But something like a public statement seems to be like, okay, that's a simple thing, let's start there, right? There's a one way to start collaborating.
I think we got 25 different organizations
and a whole bunch of individuals. Yeah. So she withdrew from speaking, but did not issue a statement.
But it's not too late.
If you're listening.
This is awesome that you refused to speak. It's really, you're like not too late to say why, so that everyone knows it's not like you had a health reason or personal emergency, right?
You're listening to the Final Straw Radio. Villita Red de Solidaridad members Rozalinda, Pura and Lynn continue talking about the scope and logic of undocumented youth detention in the so-called U.S. More about the project on Twitter and Facebook or at their site, lvsolidaridad.com. If you appreciate the work that we do here at the Final Straw, I would invite you, this is Burst speaking as himself, I would invite you to consider making a donation. We have a Patreon, we have a PayPal, and we have a Venmo. We also have thank you gifts that are available for recurrent donations. And also you can purchase merch, which helps the project along. Our operating costs aren't really that much per month, but contributing to it allows us to actually invest in infrastructure for better microphones, like you may be hearing the improvement in the sound of our audio over the last year. It helps us to take the time to train new folks. You may have heard 2 new contributors, one among them Cypress, who's contributed a couple of commentaries so far, which is awesome. And it also allows us the opportunity to, without digging too much into our working class pockets, to attend presentations, conferences, and to go and actually speak to the people that are doing on-the-ground organizing. So, for instance, you'll hear a couple of upcoming Chicago-based conversations. We'll be airing in the coming month and a half a conversation with a couple of folks that have been dedicated to South Chicago Anarchist Black Cross for a number of decades, a project that has distributed literature to countless prisoners and helped to politicize them on the inside with a libertarian, anti-capitalist perspective. If you like that stuff, if you like hearing those voices, understand that we are not getting rich off of this by any means. But we do this out of a sense of passion. And the more that you can contribute, or if you can contribute at all in a monetary way, it helps us to further do this work. It helps to pay for the stickers that we end up distributing to social centers around North America or Turtle Island. It helps us to distribute those same stickers to publishers where people or groups like PM Press or AK Press or Burning Books end up including them along with the books that they're sending out, which increases the potential listenership of the show. We've already been in contact in the last couple of months with a few people that heard about our project from those stickers that came along with books they got in the mail. And that means that they're also getting easier access to hear about these voices in struggle on the ground that are so important. If you don't have money to contribute, that's totally fine. Send us an email, give us some ideas of a show, get into contact with us. One thing you could do if you live in an area that has community radio is you could contact those radio stations if you'd like to hear us out on the airwaves, so that someone might randomly run across us and hear these voices from La Villita, for example. Maybe get inspired. Maybe change their minds on how they think about the terminology and the way that power describes undocumented youth detention or baby jails. There's all sorts of ways to contribute and help us out.
So I'd be curious about kind of shifting gears. You had mentioned that there's about 160 different facilities around the country, and Jose is back in Texas. There's a lot of places where this struggle that you've got, which is very particular in Chicago, the way that y'all are going about it and the groups that you're interacting with. But this is on a continental scale, like all of occupied Turtle Island by the U.S. has the potential to have these facilities all around, and I'd imagine that there's not necessarily the same toolkits built up and relationships built up in other places as there is in Chicago. So how do you work to network with other communities that are maybe either trying to ascertain if there is a facility in their area, or what sort of relationships they need to leverage to try to build up resistance locally?
Mm-hmm. I mean, part of it is just the simple obstacles of finding out if there's a facility in your area. So part of what we can do and what we're trying to do is build a more accurate national map. ProPublica has built one. It's woefully inaccurate. It's fine that it's there. They don't update it.
We're trying to do better.
And also they don't, it's not a dynamic, right? And it's certainly not a participatory thing. So we want to build and make publicly accessible a simple but kind of continuously updated national map. It's not easy, and there's no way for us to be accurate. We have to kind of read between the lines a lot of times. We'll know places where we'll know that it's there in a certain town, but we can't find the address, right? So that's part of what we can do. Another thing we've been trying to do is whenever there's a gathering, whenever there's an abolitionist gathering somewhere, that we can participate in, we'll try. But, you know, it's hard for us to travel. We got responsibilities and kids, and money is not easy. So sometimes we do it through Skype. Sometimes the Bend the Bars conference in Lansing was close enough that we could drive and go and just kind of workshop. And there were folks there who were saying, like, I live in Kansas City, anything close to me, let's help you look, right? Folks in Oakland, are there things close to me? Like,
and we are willing to travel. There's always someone that's willing to travel, you know, open up your couch.
I think that's a dream project, is making a map where we start with a decent idea, not all of them, but a decent idea, and actually being able to go to different places where there is interest to say, okay, let's help you, let's do some kind of a workshop or public meeting where we can share a lot of the research we have. If we can't travel, we can web conference, we can do it other ways, right? But we're definitely would be super excited to help in whatever way support local groups in coming together around it. And we've seen how few people it takes to start. Yeah. That's the other thing, is like, it doesn't take more than 3 people to actually start a local group that says, oh, we have some of these close by. Mm-hmm. Let's go learn about them. Let's go look, so that you can actually see the schedule if you just stand there all day. Mm-hmm. Let's start to put out information. Let's do a teach-in. Let's have a community meeting. The Rogers Park group formed with just a handful of folks. We're hoping that the Beverly folks, they invited, these 2 young people are bringing together a group of neighbors at the local library, inviting us to give a talk, right? Trying to see, can they get neighbors involved, right?
And part of what I think we're doing is we're trying, especially in recent months, kind of late summer, early fall, we've started to kind of do the heavy lifting on compiling all of the things that we've written or researched or developed over the years into very packageable workshop toolkits, flyers, things like that, that can be offered so much more easily to people who are wanting to adapt them to their local context and start a struggle. So we are kind of in the process of getting as many of our materials into a spreadable format. So that, I mean, like Pura was saying, we're very interested in traveling when that's possible, but also to have online things that are so available and so accessible for people to start their own teach-ins, start their own flyers and things like that. Just, it's been years that different people have been doing this kind of research and analysis and developing the ways of what's the most efficient way to give a one-on-one workshop on this issue. And explain the national system, and then kind of focus in on the local context, and just doing some of the heavy lifting with that. It's not like there's a lot of other kind of resources or research archives available online for this particular issue, and so the more that we can do to get those materials available to people, I think is something that we're pretty excited about. And even just like the primer for the leaked documents, it's just that sort of stuff that we have some more of the experience or energy to do, I think has been a recent focus as well.
So our website now, LVSolidaridad.com, does have several different collections of information. One is like a library of documents for people who want to do like a lot of reading and stuff. The other one has the FAQs, which is you can just scroll down, and it's in a much more bite-sized way of breaking down the different topics. And I think it's here that we want to, in one of these sections, we want to put in the primer on the leaked documents, and we're also working on a zine format that that compiles a lot of the things we've learned from the 101 workshops that we do in different, like, when we do it together, it's different than when it's with this other, right? So, like, depending on who's doing it, it kind of unfolds in different ways. But after many of them, we're trying to make a kind of toolkit that that folks can use. I think it's actually very hard for people to do a first info session. This was something we experienced certainly with the group in Rogers Park. Again, really experienced organizers who had done their own research, who had been preparing themselves for months, who were really solid on their critique and analysis, and who also were like, really wanted support and not doing the teach-in themselves, right? It was like, we're not sure how to prepare for the Q&A. We're not sure what the right approach is, right? And hopefully after, and we're like, we'll do our best to do one. And then also, hey, there's no perfect workshop. Like, so the perfect workshop will last 5 months. You do your best. You have 5 things you're going to try to say. You'll get a million stupid questions. You try your best to answer them. You'll get some really great questions and comments too. And that's it. And then half the time you say, I really don't know that, right? Like, there's no... but it's such an intimidating thing because you don't feel like you can, you don't know, you know what questions you're going to get, and you feel like you cannot answer them.
And you feel like you've only got this one chance, and like the people that are in the room, like if you don't grab them, like never again will they come to the workshop or get involved in movement.
So, but like for instance, when the workshop we did in Beverly, after that, the young person who organized it was like, oh my God, after this, if you can send me the notes, I feel confident to do a second one myself. And we're like, all right. Yeah. So I think sometimes it's that first workshop. I think it's sometimes that first day that you go to these places. It's a similar thing of, I remember when we would first propose to folks, let's go. There'd be a community meeting about detained kids, you know, and then that someone else would be having. And then we would go and say, this is, you know, a great conversation. We're loving it. And one of the facilities is just 3 blocks away. How about we go there? Like, oh, no, because it would endanger them. Because what we've been told is this. And we should just write some postcards or do a toy drive, right? And like a lot of fear and crying and screaming. And like the conversation breaks down. The meeting breaks down. It ain't going to happen. It's just like, wow, and like who's going to take who on, and what are the weird political strategies going on to block the idea that we can actually, let's move the conversation from here. Here's an event, there's 30 people. We can just move the event a few blocks and have the same, it was a nice day, it was summer, it was beautiful. We can just have it just standing around outside, in front of it, right, on the sidewalk. No, the same people who were really screamy, terrified, a few months later, we organized the thing, we were singing, it wasn't even huge. They kind of showed up, and then they were like, oh, this is so great, like this big relief, right? This thing of, I cannot imagine myself going. I will spend months worrying about what's this going to be like. But once I go one time, it's like, oh my God, it's really nice, it's really lovely, it's not too bad, it's okay. You know, it's like exciting, and it's a relief to be here. We now have the month of December. We're saying we're just going to sing. We're going to do sing-alongs. We're going to sing down these walls. We've been told, like Jose told us a few days ago, like, they can hear you. I can't go there. You all have to go there, right? He said, if one person is on the sidewalk chanting, the kids can hear them, right? So, okay, we don't have to organize something formal. It can be spontaneous. So we made like a durational event on Facebook. Just be like, hey, whenever you can go, whenever you so feel like, I got 20 minutes today, I don't live far, I'll go. You can share it on here, and then maybe other people can join you, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, we're pretty sure what we expect is that it's not easy for people to initiate who have never done it. The only people initiating are going to be people who have already done it. And hopefully folks could then join it, right? That it's highly unlikely that people will, of their own accord, even if they cognitively are right there, that they will of their own accord make that step first without being invited to something. We'll be there at this time, you're welcome to join us, right? So it's on groups that have done this already to say, on this day at this time we'll be there singing, you're welcome to join us. Okay? So that's an experiment. Let's see how many.
And that goes to show that we sometimes should meet people at their capacity. You know, not everyone is ready to, you know, jump in, but at least I'm always like, okay, you know, what can you do? You know, can you show up? Can you share? Can you, you know, have these conversations with your family? Yes, sit down at the dinner table with that uncle that's, you know, annoying as hell. He's going to be there anyways, you know? But also, like, if you want to send money, send money. If you want to send art supplies, not just us, but any organization that is working to mobilize, to mobilize the community and to free our community needs these similar tools. You know, makes our life better. Drop off, you know, I made you 1,000 copies of each of your, you know, like that would save us time, save us money, that would give us, you know, hands. And then, you know, you can come out to a sing-along, you can come out to a march, you know, you can come out to a workshop, and soon, you know, we're arriving at your place, you know, at your event, and, it's all about what you're capable of at the time. But, I particularly expect something from everyone because, this is the price that we give for living here, and this is our responsibility.
I really enjoyed meeting people today who were just going home from work, right? We were at that time, or they were on their way from point A to point B. And that's just the block that they go down. It's a very busy street, and they would just walk by and go, "Oh my God, I had no idea! Oh my God, I had no idea!" And so a few times I said, anytime you walk by here, like. You walk by here a lot? Oh yeah, anytime you just, as you're walking, you can go. And then I started and it just went, freedom! Like nice and loud. Like, that's it. Like, they'll hear you. Like, do that one thing. Every time you walk, just do that one little chant. And that's a start for you. Like, really, I can do that? I'm like, yeah, look, let's do it again. Freedom out! You just did something, right? And so.
If the people all do that, then suddenly it's like.
Yeah, so like there's a different kind of chorus that's formed. I think there is actually a very low threshold for entering. Like Pura said, like whenever we hand out flyers, like, it's not easy to make copies of flyers, and people can make 50 copies and bring them back or send them, right? Like there's all kinds of ways that people can amplify. But also, a lot of folks don't have any experience with the culture of organizing, right? So we live in a very isolating social order. A lot of folks are crushed by what they see, what they think. They might be aware, they might be struggling, right? And they have no idea how that can link up to any kind of shared conversation, right? Even just figuring like you can have, like you were saying, you can have a conversation at the dinner table. It's not this individualized dilemma. What can I do? I'm never gonna bring down this whole thing, right? And I think for some of us who have been lucky enough to stumble into community contexts where that intelligence is there, that intelligence has been built in collaboratively, it's sometimes easy to forget how crushing it is when you don't have that context, right? When it really does feel so much like an individual dilemma that plays in your mind only, and that's the only avenue for it. And then it's like, so then you have to shut it off and go about in a total denial, because you can't survive, right? Like you can't psychically survive in this world that we're living in. If you do, I think if you are in any way conscious and have no context for collective action, I think denial is the only option for folks.
Yeah, and that also goes into the setting of Chicago. We would have at least twice as many people. There's two big organizations at least that should be vocalizing against the system, but one is a part of the system and the other one is being nursed by the other. And they are suckling on ICER. And if they were sharing this information with the people that believe in them, the people that are always like, well, why isn't OCAD doing it? Or, and this is always around a certain type of people in our community. And these two organizations are blinding people, are miseducating people, and should be on the forefront of, liberating children and reuniting families and, fuck these borders and everything. But that has also stopped us. So we are nowhere in full force, but we are mighty as hell with the people that are out there.
Yeah, I think if organizations like OCAD, whatever, they've got their own fronts that they're sinking their energy into, but that doesn't stop them from using their Facebook page or their mailing list to forward something. It does not stop them at all. Have you noticed NIJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center, which is part of Heartland Alliance?
Yes, you're right.
And they are the leading, I think they're seen nationally as one of the leading kind of forces for using the law to get justice for immigrants, or using the law as harm reduction, right? In addition to that, they have a staff of, paid researchers and highly trained folks who have a lot of weight in doing FOIA requests. You can learn how to do a FOIA request, but if you don't come from an organization that can actually sue the federal government, your FOIA request won't be honored. So, the brave NIJC, because their FOIA requests are the ones that sit at the basis of every bit of research that anybody does on immigration. Then they turn about, like, we've just discovered this horrible thing about the policies. Thank you, NIJC, for bringing it out, right? So it's like this like wonderful organization that is part of Heartland Alliance, that has their lawyers and what's the other staff, paralegals or whatever, go into the detention centers and give Know Your Rights workshops to children, 3, 4, 5, right? Know Your Rights workshops, and then these children have these sheets that they have to sign that they've received this legal service, so you have babies putting X's on there, like literally, and this is part of what they do.
So they can turn it into the government to get
So there's like, this is their accounting of, we did this many services, we provided this many Know Your Rights workshops, right? Except if you like can really picture what this Know Your Rights workshops means, it's like you're a detained toddler being told that you can hire any lawyer you want, but you don't even know what that means. You can't make a phone call. I mean, this is all insane, right? This is all insane. But they're willing to do that in order to be able to have the front, and in order to be able to sort of count the good work that they're doing. And we know that NIJC have been like, but we have to do all this because, what else are we going to do? Like, it's the only way that we can have access to these kids, so we can give legal services. Would you rather they have no legal services whatsoever? And we're like, you need to be clear that what you're doing is working for a detention company and working inside of that structure. And so we've been protesting, right, against NIJC, and that's something that's been like blowing people's brains, like, oh my God, can you believe they're protesting NIJC? That's insane.
The ones who claim to be advocates for the children.
Right, and the ones who are the only approved ones to give legal, so like, you want these kids to not have lawyers, right, is the problem. And so that's even a harder sell than Heartland. NIJC has started changing their fucking tune. NIJC has bigger problems from other shit that they've done, like the Crete Detention Center proposal was going on like 10 years ago, and NIJC's official position was that they're not going to oppose it because it's closer to Chicago and they'll have better access to their clients than what was happening with people detained in Tri-State and other places. Right? That was their official position at the time, which really was sabotaging of those of us trying to fight this thing, as you can imagine, right? Last year, Meg, our beloved Meg McCarthy, she was like, oh yes, well, we were wrong. So now finally people can see what we knew was their official position. They're finally acknowledging that during the Crete issue, they had this sort of wrong position, which they've now changed. They're now having the wrong position, which they'll change years from now, but they've started to try to create distance between themselves and Heartland while they're still operating, as Heartland. So they've moved their offices. The first thing, they're physically not at the same address anymore. They've changed their first paragraph of their website, which used to say, we provide legal services to young people in shelters, blah, blah, blah. Their first sentence now says detention centers, to children in detention centers, after which they go back to shelters and in care, right? But the first thing you see is them being like starting to, right? And then now there's like some people that are upper executives of NIJC who are like forwarding our stuff on social media, right? They were protesting Heartland. They were like forwarding our shit, I'm like, I think NIJC are starting to make their move of distancing themselves from Heartland. The contract's coming up soon. Are they hoping to find is there something going on, right? But anyway, we've seen this shift. They never would have said we provide legal services to children in detention facilities in Chicago. They would have never said that unless we forced them to. That in itself is a big thing. There's another entity that is at the University of Chicago, the Young Center. They have like a legal clinic for detained kids to provide child advocates. A tiny percentage of kids will have access to this.
Obviously, Jose doesn't.
Obviously, Jose doesn't. Yes. Obviously, the vast majority of them don't. And, they all should, and they all shouldn't need one. But their rhetoric of these are children in shelters, these are care facilities, and so forth, is very visible. They also get lots of awards, and they're also present nationally. So they've sort of tried to challenge us and say, but are you saying you want children to not have advocates? Like, you want children to not have advocates? And then their executive director has said, literally, like in a verbal conversation, not in the public room where we were, but following us in the hallway, to say this, saying, but we do good work. Don't you think we do good work? And so our response was, who is telling you that your work is good? What accountability process do you have to arrive at the evaluation of, is our work good or is our work no good? Like, who are you accountable to? And the response was, well, the children, and that was, I think even this person kind of like stopped and was sort of like horrified at themselves for, it's like the kids can't hold you accountable. Somebody has to hold you accountable and tell you when your work is shit and when your work is good. Who is holding you accountable? Well, but without us, what would happen with these children, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a very circular logic, right? We're the only ones who can save the children. Without us, no one will save the children. It's a perfect circle. The Young Center is kind of invisible in this. They're still doing their thing. Nobody's pushing on them. But they're also much smaller than NIJC. NIJC is starting to put some distance, change their rhetoric a little bit,
Just throw their social capital towards a different momentum.
Not quite yet. I think if they did that, they would be against, in front of the wave. I think they're positioning themselves to be less easy targets because they're freaking lawyers, right? So it's like, if our website constantly says shelter, shelter, it's going to make us look bad when people start questioning their shelters. So let's call them detention centers, right? And still say it's harm reduction. Yeah, I think they're trying to just take some of the arguments away the easy arguments that we would have. But it's been interesting to watch them and then now somebody's yeah, these people are fighting for children. I don't know. There's some calculation going on, but it's to have a war of words. Words matter here. Words are the primary cover they have. They're not out there with their guns. They don't have bars on windows. All they have is words, right? To be trying to have a war with words with people who are, Evelyn Diaz's $350,000 a year salary for doing nothing but putting out rhetoric is really hard, with Meg, whatever her name is, and NIJC, and professional lawyers and it's not so easy. But people are really smart, actually. People can get it. If you give people a chance to just pause and look critically at the discourse, it doesn't take that long, actually. And it depends, in the neighborhood, too.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just ask then, how can people find out more? How can they keep in touch with you? This won't air until the 15th of December. But folks, I can definitely put into the notes for this and link out some information about Jose's legal fund. But is there, independent of y'all, a spot that people should go for Jose's legal fund?
Not yet, but hopefully soon.
If there is by the 15th,
we can be in contact about
and
that.
there's at least a 2-month struggle with his court date, so it's not like people can't, they let them, no, we can't donate anymore. No, send more.
We have a Venmo and a PayPal set up for that specifically, and we have the little video that introduces Jose and him speaking. We have 2 little videos, so they can be linked, and we can make sure that the videos are also on the website.
And some of his music.
And some of his music, we have to put the music up too. Yeah.
So the main methods that we are updating most frequently are the Little Village Solidarity Network Facebook page, and then our website, LVSolidaridad.com.
Yeah, but we also really have to understand is that being an abolitionist is we're set people free. Let's give justice. And then it's not about, all right, you're out, see you later, congratulations. You have to follow through. And that's why it's so expected of us, at least in my opinion, that we continue to struggle along with Jose. Not just because he looks like he could be part of my family, but because, he was a part of the system. We're asking for his freedom and everyone else's freedom. But because he's a person, and he's a youth, and he's a father, and, this is his northern ancestral land. So it's just We cannot be these people that are like, all right, you should come out, high five, see you later. No, we need to send funds. We need to assist him in any way we can. And everyone else that's coming after him, because we can't imagine that he's the only one out there.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing this and taking the time and for the work that you do.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having us.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.